Today I'm going to show you how I did this virtual production entirely in Blender with just my iPhone for recording. This was super simple. It plays back in real time in Eevee, so it was a ton of fun to work with inside of Blender, and I'm going to show you how I go through this process. Now we started off just capturing the footage. Like I said, it was on my iPhone. I just had it positioned on my desk, and what I used was a really handy app called Filmic Pro, which let me capture footage on my iPhone in RAW in 10-bit color and up to 60 frames per second. Now that's going to depend on your hardware too. I have the iPhone 13, so I was only able to capture in 30 frames per second, which makes it a little harder to key out some of the motion blur that might happen if you have fewer frames. So if you can do 60 FPS, I would highly recommend it. And I just had this positioned on my desk. I'm just using a little pop-up green screen that I got off of Amazon, and you can get something very, very similar. They're super accessible. They're all over the place from these little like pop-up screens. Mine, it has a stand and it rolls up. So there's a bunch of tools for this to make it super easy to just put a green screen behind you while you're sitting. I used a stool to sit on rather than a chair, so I wouldn't have something behind me, so I could actually put the chair in 3D. And one of the things you might notice if you're looking at this footage is that I don't actually have any footage below my torso. So where did these legs come from? And this is one of the beautiful things about doing this virtual production inside of Blender, is that literally I can just recreate my legs in 3D, and it is surprising how believable this is from the camera perspective. So you can see, even as it moves around, you're actually getting some depth, some parallaxing on the legs, because they are three-dimensional. Now you're not getting that on your hands and the hand motions. But again, this depends on what you want to shoot it for. For simple videos where I'm just talking through a concept, this is a super easy way to get a realistic virtual environment and to do the compositing all inside of Blender. And it looks really good for this purpose, right? Again, if you want to be moving around, this might not be the best solution. But sitting still, and I'll show you a couple of tricks for how I incorporated this footage into the scene. So we can jump into the materials, and I'll show you how to set this up specifically for Eevee, because there's just a couple things with the transparency that you might have to twiddle around with. So basically, this is a principled BSDF. I've got my footage plugged in, and I've got two versions of it. This is an EXR sequence that's full resolution. I think it's 4K. And this is, and you want the extra resolution if you're going to want to like punch in and punch out, because the more resolution you have, obviously the easier it's going to be to get closer without it starting to look grainy. But this is just a low res MOV that I exported for the real-time playback while I'm editing. And so you set this up, you can just drag your footage into the shader, and this is obviously super simple. Plugs into the color, plugs into the alpha, done. Apart from that, the biggest thing is I added in a mix shader here so that if we have glossy rays, I'm not getting reflections of this footage, because what I had was I've got this glass surface behind myself in the scene. And so I wanted to get rid of reflections because it was reflecting the front of my face onto the glass rather than the back, so it looked weird. So there's some things you can do again just to tweak based off of your environment. You might not need this for your setup, but then also because you need this to be transparent, you're going to want to use alpha hashed instead of the alpha blend mode, because with alpha blend you actually get better edges, but the problem is that I'm using depth of field on the camera in Eevee, and you'll see that like from the camera perspective, if you're trying to use depth of field, which it looks really good and adds a lot of realism to the shot, but it doesn't work with the alpha blend mode. It's just, for some reason, with the way that it's calculating light bounces in Eevee, the approximations that it does, it will not work out. And I tried a bunch of different ways to kind of like make this work, and I just couldn't. So if you guys have a better way to do this, I'd love to hear about it, because the alpha blend mode is the way to go. But again, alpha hashed, it ended up looking really nice. And I don't think there's a huge discernible difference when you're kind of pulled back like this for 90% of the shots. So it's just a marginal improvement that you might see in the final render if you could use the alpha blend mode. And that's just going to depend, again, do you need that depth of field? I thought it was important for this scene. And again, if you want, you can just render this whole thing out in cycles as well. It just depends on what kind of render times you're looking for. But it's really cool that you have the option of getting this whole scene into Eevee and getting some super realistic looking renders depending on your use case using the depth of field, motion blur, and some screen space reflections. And it all works out really nicely. And again, you have the opportunity for some real-time playback for editing these little like animations and motion graphics and things you might want to add to the scene. So working in Eevee was the way to go for me for this one. Once I had that material set up, then basically it was just keying the camera, right? So it was super simple. I had a couple pan ins, pan out. That really allows you to show that there's real depth in the scene, because if this was just a 2D comp where you took a video footage and put it on top of an image, you're not going to get this ability to like see the parallax of the elements around. And this is where that depth of field helps as well, because as you push into the camera view, you're able to see, oh, like we're actually getting realistic depth of field. You can do this little motion graphic stuff and it blurs you. You get the dimensionality to it. So again, being able to push in and push out. You can also rotate the camera. But if you try to do more than pushing in, like zooming in and zooming out and doing the rotations, there's only so much room you have. So if I like try to rotate this around the subject, you can see that pretty quickly you start to see it starts to feel two-dimensional, right? So keep that to a minimum, but you do have some room, to move around laterally, and again, to push in and push out and things like that. So there's a lot of flexibility in this workflow. It's going to depend on what you're using it for. Then I added some camera shake on top of that. This is just, I do this in most of my camera animation. I just key rotation on some of these axes for the camera, go into the graph editor and into my modifiers here, and I'll play around with it a bit, right? Something subtle with a really big scale and a really low strength. So you just have a little bit of movement. Again, this feels like it was a live camera shot, but all the footage is totally static. So it works out really well. Some of these other little things that I did just to add some like nice effect, I actually added some noise on the rotation for the chair here. And you can see I just keyed the Z rotation on the chair and added a tiny little bit of noise to that, just so that like, this is again a subtle effect, but you get this sense that like the chair is moving as I'm moving my arms. It's little things that kind of sell the blending of the character and the scene. And then one other thing you'll notice here is that I actually have this little empty here. I'm using that for the focus of the camera. That was just the easiest way for me to move the focus of the camera around without having to key the actual focus distance of the camera or something like that. It's a very visual representation. I can quickly see that it's focused on the face or this object here and things like that. So one more thing that kind of helps to iron out this workflow. And that's it. That's all it takes to get started with virtual production inside of Blender. Again, you can just use your iPhone and a simple green screen you can grab off of Amazon. Let me know if you guys have any questions about the workflow or other things you'd like to see. Please drop a like and a subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.